Welcome, everyone, to this event at the New York Encounter. Whether you're here at the Metropolitan Pavilion or online, welcome. My name is Anujeet Sareen. I'm a portfolio manager at an investment firm in Philadelphia called Brandywine Global, and I have the privilege of moderating this discussion. Before I introduce the topic, let me thank Illumia for helping to organize this event. We're here to talk about economic inequality. You see the title of the event. This is one of the challenges of capitalism, its distributional consequences. I'm going to start by just giving you just a really quick story in my own life that connects to this. I was born in India in 1972, but my parents moved here to the United States as legal immigrants in 1977 when I was 5 years old. My dad had a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. My mom had a bachelor's degree. My dad had a pretty good job at a manufacturing company in India. But they left all that, and they came here for me and my younger sister. America is the land of opportunity. They thought we would have a better education here and a better life than they could possibly offer us back in India. The first year we're here, my dad pushes a hot dog cart right here in Manhattan to make ends meet. He'd eventually save up enough money to start a grocery store over in Coney Island in Brooklyn. And that grocery store would support our family for the next 15 years. We were a lower middle income family living in Brooklyn. You know, I went to the public schools, elementary school, the public middle school, and eventually was able to get a scholarship to high school and college and have a successful career in finance. This is why my parents came. This is why millions of immigrants come to the United States. It's the land of opportunity. And it's, of course, it's not just for immigrants, right? It's for all Americans, all of people here. This is what we want to offer in this country. And one of the questions that brings us to this conversation is that as true as it once was? Is this the land of opportunity? Do we offer this to all as we have in the past, or is it really more now available to a smaller and smaller group? The question isn't just about inequality of opportunity, it's about equality of income inequality, about wealth inequities. We'll get into some of those issues, and part of the reason we're having this discussion here is that it's not just an issue for America. This is an issue that a number of countries are facing around the world. We had just a couple of elections this past year in Peru and Chile, where this was the central topic that decided the election. China is confronting this in its own way as well. One last thing I'll say before I introduce our speakers is that in light of the theme of the New York Encounter, the urge for truth, I would really invite you to come to this with an open mind. Income inequality is a subject that becomes partisan very, very quickly. I mean, I talk to folks who lean to the left politically, and they have an idea of what it means, why it's the case, and what to do about it. I talk to folks who lean to the political right, and they've got their own narrative about this and what to do about it. And I think this conversation will be more fruitful for everyone, I think, if we're open to where the dialogue leads, and not least because I think fundamentally this is a question for each of us individually before it's a policy and societal question. How do we ourselves put ourselves in front of the questions about economics and justice? Okay, having said that, let me introduce our speakers. We have two speakers joining us virtually. The first is Professor Jean-Paul Fitoussi. Professor Fitrici is the Professor Emeritus at the Institut d'Etudes Politiques de Paris and Professor at the Luis University in Guido Carli in Rome. He's also a member of the Center for Capitalism and Society at Columbia University. Since 2013, he is the co-chairman of the high-level expert group at the OECD on the measurement of economic performances and social progress. Welcome, Professor. I should note, by the way, Professor Fitoussi is joining us from Paris, where it is 10 o'clock at night at this hour, so we really appreciate him taking the time to join us.
That's okay.
We're also joined by Professor Branko Milanovic. He's a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He served as a lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years. He's the author of numerous books on income inequality, and the last one being Capitalism Alone. And then finally, last but not least, I have with me on stage here Samuele Rosa. Samuele works as a senior economist at the IMF in the development countries area. He's carried out his career entirely in international organizations. He worked at the European Commission and the European Monetary Institute, involved in the preparatory work related to the establishment of the European single currency, then moving to the ECB until the launch of the euro. Welcome, all of you. So, Professor Milanovic, Branko, let's start with you. When you hear the term income inequality, it bespeaks a certain measure. What is unequal when it comes to income? Can you, given your extensive research, set the table for us? How unequal are we versus history, globally? How do you think about this?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. Obviously, it is a pleasure to be here. I, of course, regret that I'm actually unable to be there physically, but hopefully some other time that would be easier to do. So let me actually start with the example that you very interestingly gave, your own story, which of course was the story of many immigrants and their families in the United States. There was a very strong perception and probably reality that the US was a land of opportunity and that social mobility was high. But what we know in terms of facts also confirms that, for example, in the most recent work, which was only published a couple of years ago by Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson, historically they showed that the United States, we are talking about the US before the independence and then in those days, was actually much more equal than European countries. And particularly, there was no hugely wealthy people at the very top, like where you had a very high inequality and high wealth at the top. So the US historically had periods where it was equal, so relatively equal. So, we should not forget that. However, we know nowadays that the US is more unequal in terms of income inequality and in terms of wealth inequality than majority of OECD countries. So in other words, compared to its own, sort of peers in terms of income, level of income, US inequality is relatively high. Actually, it is the highest in OECD countries, unless you include, if you exclude countries like Chile and Turkey. And on the other hand, we also know empirically that social mobility in the US has declined. So this is how I would put it. I can give numbers, in the terms of the Gini coefficient, which is very often used. But, I think it's sufficient just to say that the US currently has a significantly higher inequality than the countries in Europe. And I think that's the major story. And I think the second point is that that high level of inequality is correlated with relatively low social mobility.
Thank you. Maybe Samuele, you could add to this.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to make a quick comments. I'm very happy that Branko is with us. What Branko did was really so we knew inequality was an issue in advanced economies, and US in a way, in that sense, leads, but it's not the only one. But it was not until Branko came with a huge work to put this, in a way, narrative, this anecdotal evidence into hard data that the discussion really flourished in our profession, and because there is evidence, there is a reality that we can look, then kind of, in a way, the polarization became less marked because there is something we can start off. So this is, in a way, to relate to the title of this encounter and also of the New York encounter. So just some data. I'd like instead to put some data out there. Now focusing on the US. So on income inequality, if you look at the growth in real income of the famous 1% of the US over the last 2 decades or so, the growth was like about 350%. It tripled to up to 3 to 4 times more, and this was people already with a very high income. Then you look at the Standard & Poor's, so the in a way market capitalization story, and you are even higher. It's about 5 to 6. But then when you look at the CAO, so the 1/10 of 1%, or even I'd say 1/20th, so the Fortune 500 guys, the increase over the last say 2 decades of their income was 1,000%. So it increased by 10 times. And now it's somehow hard to just assume that it's all driven by increasing productivity. And there's a big, debate in my profession. One test for that is that the increase in income also occurred during the two big financial crises, including, and actually especially in the financial sector. So it's hard to say that productivity increased when, financial institutions were part of a kind of almost destruction of wealth because of the crisis. So there's something else that must be also driving this increase in real wages. And if it's not productivity, there are other culprits. There are other hypotheses in economics that we can look at. I want to say also something about other measures of inequality. Of course, you mentioned that very quickly. We look at inequality of health and education, so input and outcomes. We look at the perception of inequality, which seems to be growing in recent years. There is more data out there. There is more buzz. And so people care much more than before. But I wanted to speak about wealth inequality. And kind of here's the news. If inequality, or the fact, if inequality on income is actually very high and growing, inequality of wealth is a multiple of that. And so I wanted to kind of, let's say we run an experiment here to make it a little bit more visual. Let's say we bring back the time of 2010. And you send me to look for the most wealthy people in the world in a way that you want me to have their wealth together matching the wealth of the bottom 50%, 3.5 billion of people. Okay? And you ask me, we need to prepare a room here. How big has to be this room? How many people I need to match the wealth of of 3.5 billion of the lower distribution of the world in 2010? And this was about 400 people, 388. This is Oxfam studies. Now you ask yourself, well, this is quite staggering. The idea that less than 400 people owns what 3.5 billion people owns. Of course, it also tells you that these 3.5 billion people owns nothing, almost, right? Then you ask yourself, okay, but how is, going to the question, kind of market economy, capitalistic market economy, what is the trend of this quite staggering inequality? And I don't want to look at this when we had COVID. During these 3 years of COVID, a lot of things that happened. We can come back to that. Let's stop just 1 year before. I ran the same exercise. I go around the world to pick up the top wealthier people to match the 3.5 billion of people. And remember that 10 years ago, it was 2010, about 388 people. And I come here to this place, and it's enough for me to have 42 people. So 42 people would match the wealth of 3.5 billion people. This is, by any means, a staggering data. I mean, again, data shows more the reality that touches you. And then you say to yourself, okay, how this has evolved. You look at 2016, and you look at the increase in the value of the wealth. Shares, lands, real estate, whatever. These are very complex calculations, but the increase in wealth in this 1 year, just to have a sense, 82% of that went to the top 1%. So it is really staggering. And US is not the exception. Actually, in a way, leads. You have about 2 families owning, one of which is busy with important retail trade distribution, owning the wealth of 1/3 of the American people, and you have about 1/3 of American people, 30% owning no asset at all. So the numbers are really staggering on wealth, And what that means is that if you think about mobility like, climbing stairs, of course, if you have to jump 3 meters to climb 1 steps, obviously it's impossible not to understand that inequality at some point also affects mobility. Okay, and we see that in the data as Branko suggested, and that affects also kind of in a way the social cohesion. So what I want to say is that inequality of wealth is big, but there are other things happening meanwhile. As this inequality kind of fed and expanded, we see other stuff that in a way forms the fabric of our society and social cohesion. I want to talk about two things. First of all, trust. Okay, Gallup survey, this is the best data I think I can find, is comparable. Again, over the last 2 decades or so, you ask people in this country now, do you trust institutions? And when I say institutions, I say your local parish, your grassroots community, probably your family, of course the federal government. Do you trust in the possibility that a collective action can be put together to deal with problems that affects us all? And the number of people saying somewhat yes or really yes went to 41 to 31%, which is already very low to me. But then you ask another question, which is in understanding the complex world in which we live and how to address the problem that it poses. Unemployment, security, future of your kids, health, you name it, key important issue. How much do you trust that some indication, some suggestion on how to see those things and how to solve those things can come from discussing with others, with engaging with others? And this is really amazing to me. I mean, we went from close to 80% to barely 50%, which means, 50%, so half of the people here in this room would say, in addressing, I'm just joking, of course, in addressing challenging issue, I don't need to talk with others. Which means I rather talk with people who already agree with what I say, which also makes you understand why the social media takes a big part of that. So, are we set for some thinking about where capitalism is leading? Look at inequality, look at mobility, look at trust. I think yes. There is something to be said. And I need to say right away up front, whatever I'm saying here does not engage the board of IMF of my management. So I take it as an open discussion. So my answer is yes. And I want to also focus, last comment is, there are obviously other assets, other value in the balance sheet of a society, which is not just income and wealth. And we need to also understand the place that they take, social capital and relationship. I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thanks, Samuele. I want to move on to Professor Fitoussi, but Branko, one last quick question. Give us a sense of time. When was the last time the U.S. was this unequal in history?
Well, it depends really what measures you use, but according to some measures, if you don't look at the amount of redistribution which happened, if you simply look at what is called market incomes, then the U.S. today is as unequal as it was in the beginning of the 20th century. So basically, you have to go back a whole century. If you include also redistribution, which is now much higher, because obviously you have direct taxations, which is direct taxes which are greater than in the past, and you have social transfers, then probably, you would probably have to go back to the well, it's hard to say, maybe 1930s. Right. So it has been a long time that actually, U.S. has had a period where inequality went down very substantially until 1980s and then crept up until today.
Great, thank you. Jean-Paul, maybe we could switch to you. And when I hear the term income inequality, right? Income, I think, speaks to economics, to work, capitalism. Inequality speaks to democracy and justice. How do you think about these two worlds? How do they coincide?
Well, let me tell you first that I wanted to understand better inequality. We have done a lot of study on inequality. We have, with Joe Stiglitz and Anna Amartya Sen, developed a full set of measures, and recently another full set of measures. We have used the Branko measures. We have even calculated inequality of opportunity. And we did not understand why such a situation did not conduct to a catastrophe because the increase of inequality, which is, as you said, almost universal, but the leading country being the United States, uh, is present everywhere under different form. For example, in Europe, it's the only region which has known for more than 30 years mass unemployment. And mass unemployment signifies inequality, even if it does not lead directly to the inequality of income, because there are the social security system. It leads to inequality in the quality of life. It means inequality in well-being. It means inequality before the death, before the divorce, before suicide, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of way for looking at increasing inequality, and also, for example, economic insecurity. Economic insecurity is changing the life in our countries because it is increasing. At the same time, because of inequality and because of a change of powers, of a balance of powers, inequality leads to. So the only way to try to understand is to consider the comprehensive system in which we are living. And to make it short, we are living in a system that I call market democracy. What is market democracy? It's a system which is combining two principles of organization which are contradictory, totally opposed. The principle of democracy, one person, one vote, and the principle of the market, $1, one vote. So if you have not a political regime which try to make a trade-off between these two, which has to look for compromise all the time. It's why democracy is a debate on the norms of justice, because it has to look all the time for compromise between these two principles which are entering in conflict, one with the other. There was an American judge of a constitutional court who said, you can have democracy or you can have the money concentrated in few hands, but you can't have both. And what Samuele said is exactly that. We have half of the income of the planet concentrated on 42, I was speaking Italian, on 42 people. That means it's unacceptable. We have also, as a twist on democracy, the fact that the universal suffrage does not exist anymore. When you have the richer people who are proprietor of all the newspaper, the TV channel, the research center, the funding of research, they have an influence, which means that they have 1,000 at least more votes than any of us. I said 1,000, but I don't know. It should be much more. I mean, with a journal, I can influence a lot of people. It's why the election campaign are grounded on the medias. And you have also something which is completely different, which is happening completely different of what we have lived until the end of the 70s, which is the inversion of the hierarchy between the political regime and the economic regime. Now it's the economic regime which, according to the theory, is leading the system. And it is leading the system because of a doctrinal, which is false, but I mean, of a doctrinal evolution, which has said that the system arrives spontaneously at the best of all possible situations. I mean, the market, the perfect market system, what capitalism is considered to be, but it's not true. And the parallel capitalism is much less employed today, but it was some time ago, at the time of Cold War, was capitalism against communism. But now there are just market democracy, and we have the market system. But the market system can work only if no actor has a power on another actor, which is the assumption of atomicity. And if that's not true, that means we are not in a perfect market. We are in a system which is leading to market failure. And that should be combated by the state. But if the state voluntarily prevented himself to act, this correction will never appear. So I was wondering why, am I too long?
No. No, Professor, there's so much richness to what you're talking about. I think this
So
notion
I'm wondering about one thing. Why is it like that? What did happen that made us to choose the Homo economicus rather than the social being? And it was just an inversion of the time arrow. We have worked as if the neoclassical theory was posterior to the Keynesian theory. And we have done as if the neoclassical theory was the modern theory, and the Keynesian theory was the ancient theory. I'm not saying that because I'm a Keynesian, but because of a fairly different way of these two theories to consider the global system. In the neoclassical theory, you have Homo economicus, people who are not caring about others. They are just looking for the self-interest, and so everything which happened is due to their merit. That means that inequality is totally justified. Inequality is a good thing. There are some economists who have written, the president of the Economic Association has written a paper called In Defense of Inequality, because he thought that inequality is a way of giving incentives. And the Keynesian theory, at the contrary, understand people as are living in a world populated by institutions. For example, Keynes was saying that wages are paid in money, and so the best system is to have wage rigidity, monetary wage rigidity, to avoid the total chaos on the contract that people are signing, long-term contract, short-term contract, and so on. So we have forget that. We have forgot that we are, how can I say, we are directed by law, directed by an economic system, and that never existed. An economic system without a political system. Once I asked Kenneth Arrow, to tell me what was, according to him, the political system the most performing for growth. And he said,
Professor,
well,
I just want to interrupt for a second. Finish your thought, but I think I'd like to get on to some more other questions. That there's a lot of richness to what you're talking about, but I want to make sure we're able to get through some more content. But please, finish your thought.
No, I want to say, what is the political system leading to the highest growth possible? And his answer was to tell me, you know the question. No political system. And in the Adam Smith's representation, you had the invisible hand. The invisible hand was reemplacing the political system because it was harmonizing the interests of the people without that they are in society, actually. So that means that we have simplified in such a way the political and economic system, our comprehensive system, but we are no more in contact with any kind of reality. And so inequality is something monstrous, it's something obscene. It is becoming something obscene because how can a man say, my value is 5,000 times your value to another? Okay, I finish here.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's step back for a moment here because the data is the data, right? Branko, you talked about it. Samuele, you talked about it. I think this natural tension from that ordering of that hierarchy, Jean-Paul, that you just talked about, I think that's very clear as well. The thing to me that's just so striking, though, is even though inequality is as bad as it's been for nearly a century, it's not the driving force of our political discourse. We remain a very divided country. You go back 100 years ago when inequality was this bad, and you're talking the rise of trade unions, the robber barons, the Roaring '20s, the Great Gatsby, the Great Depression, a massive political swing to address this injustice. That's not as apparent in our political dialogue. I'm not saying there aren't people who are advocating it. It's just not, we're split. Why do you think that's the case if the inequality is so large? Any one of you can answer.
Who will answer? Because I have an answer for it.
Please, Jean-Paul, go. Go ahead.
I mean, it's not true that inequality has not had an important effect on the evolution of our system. First, you have the rise of extremist party everywhere. And after all, you had Trump in the US, no? And the second, you have a rise in abstention, meaning that half of the people are voting out the political regime. you have violence. And you have a rise in violence, not only in the schools, and the political debates are becoming more and more violent everywhere, and especially in the United States. And you have violence between people. And the United States is a clear case, but it is also true in France, for example. It's also true in Europe. And the reasoning is simple to understand. A man can say, if my life is valued 0, why should I value your life much more? So your life, violence, will be the consequence of this kind of reasoning. There will be no consideration for the others, because we are not living in a society, but in a categories of an heterogeneity of small groups who are not making society. And so violence is becoming more and more of a problem.
I think that's a very interesting observation. Rise of extremism, rise of violence. I don't know, Branko, Samuele, you want to add to this question?
Well, I would be, if I can, I would be rather brief on that. I actually agree with everything that Jean-Paul very sort of effectively, the points that he made. In particular, I would like to sort of underline the fact that if you define democracy as the approximately equal power to influence public outcomes, approximately equal, because it would never be obviously equal. Individuals are different. Some people are more interested, or they have greater knowledge, and others are less, and so on. That equality is so far from being real, partly or mostly because rich people are really controlling nowadays, as Jean-Paul mentioned, actually even the media. So essentially, you cannot express yourself. You have an inbuilt difference in power to start with. So that's one of the reasons of why wealth inequality, of which you spoke before, and Samuel as well, is so important, because such huge level of wealth inequality necessarily translates in huge inequality in political power. The second element, which I think is important to realize why we are maybe less sort of politically active on the issues of inequality compared to 100 years ago, is that ideologically, socialist ideologies have declined in importance. There are many reasons for that, not only because of the Soviet Union, but also because of the trade unions, which used in the past to be much more important than they are today. So I think these two reasons. One is the ideological. The second one is huge accumulation of wealth in the hands of very few people and their political power. And the third point also is the indifference. The very fact that we had in the US, 50% of the people who actually have the right to vote normally do not vote. And in the last election, that was so, you had really to live under the rock not to realize that there was election. And there are still 40% of people who did not bother to vote. So these are, I think, three elements. I said ideology, accumulation of wealth, and indifference, which is maybe due to the very fact that people know that their sort of effective power is much less than what it should be, or what at least it is claimed to be. So I think these would be the reasons, in my opinion, why we have much less of a political, inequality has much less of a political salience compared to 100 years ago.
Yes. Can I say one word about what he said? One word, which is that you are perfectly right, but the reason of that is that the political system did not solve the problem of this population. So looking at the fact that never the political system is resolving the hardest question to which they are confronted, like precariousness, like poverty, like unemployment. Somebody said, at what serve to vote? What is the utility to vote?
I
And
think.
so they abstain.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with that. Yeah.
I want to say something here on a positive side, in a sense, Jean-Paul put on the table the issue is the starting point of what is the human being about. Is he a social being defined by meaningful relationship towards, the purpose of improving the social life, or is it just a self-centered profit maximizer, atemporal, so homo economicus versus a social being, as Aristotle would say, for those who study those things. And Jean-Paul, in my view, is saying, at least to me, what I understand is that it's only through the force of a kind of ideology that we are led to disregard how important is our being together as a social being, would be the most natural part of it. It was, if we were to be thorough about understanding the link between that economy, certain things would be easier to understand. And I want to make an example here. There have been a number of Nobel Prizes in the last 10, 20 years that actually unraveled and sort of challenged this idea of the homo economicus. That in our decision about how to consume and how to invest, if we are given the chance to do so, we rather care and a lot about the implication of our consumption investment decision on others, on workers, on environment. And, if you give people, the possibility, say, spend a certain amount of your consumption or investment budget in this or that, and in this data give you the opportunity to be sure that you are taking more into account the well-being of others, of the worker of the company, of the environment, people would rather choose the second, and in particular young people. Sorry? In particular young people. So on one hand, there is this affection for democracy, active participation, not the idea of democracy. On the other hand, there is a big demand out there to participate more, even in the consumption investment life, to build a better world, I would say. That shows two things. First of all, that whatever we're told, even if the homo economicus might be a technical trick, it's fundamentally a lie, and people, when awake, when kind of considerate about themselves, show this nature of social being. But secondly, that politics nowadays, and it's certainly not just the case in the US, is not able to intercept and frame that demand, right? And so people say, well, I don't trust this institution. They really mean the way institution helps to take into account my, my desire for a socially, engaged life doesn't respond to me. So, but I think that, there is a huge market out there for a more engaged consumption and investment life of the human being. Second thing is that not everything is financial assets or economic values. So we also have to understand that there is other asset in the balance sheet of society. Therefore, we need democracy to put those dimensions to the fore. We can't, this was what we discussed last year with Raghuram, we can't have the market extend the grips on all the society, or the state for that matter. There's something else, as a social being, civil society you would call it, and a balance between the three is key to have an engaged and a meaningful life. I'll stop there. Of course, this is a big issue, big theme, but I wanted to, I want also to connect this discussion to the discussion we had last year, because there is a way that I think there is a line that holds this in a neat way.
Branko, maybe you could help us think about this more historically. You've looked at this data, I think, going back quite a ways through history, and one of the narratives that I often hear, right, is that there's a trade-off. If you decide to make a society more just on this basis, you tax the wealthy and you give to the poor in whatever form you do that, that comes at the expense of growth. That you're disincentivizing those who take risk and build businesses, and therefore growth is diminished even though your society is more equal. And it is a very common critique I hear of Europe versus US, for example. Is that trade-off, is that necessary? Is that a false trade-off, or is that true, given your assessment of history?
Well, Anujeet, it's of course one of the biggest questions maybe in economics that you're asking, because obviously there are differences of opinion, and it is a fundamental issue. Let me say very sort of briefly what my sort of perception or my view on this issue is. I do think that, of course, many people argue, as you actually said, they would actually say if you redistribute more, the incentives would be less, economic growth would be less. Now, empirically, that's kind of hard to show, and the empirical results are at least ambivalent, and some of them actually argue that the opposite is true, that actually with lower inequality, by enabling more people to actually meaningfully participate and make money and become prosperous, you're actually increasing rate of growth if you have lower inequality. But even if you do not 100% subscribe to this view, I think there is also the issue of short run versus medium run or long run. So even if it's true that you would have some losses in the short run, they are more than offset and balanced by the gains that you get over the medium run from the ability of people to actually acquire better education, to be healthier. You know, people who are not healthy, they cannot work. So this is a very important issue, not only obviously in poor countries, but even in rich countries. So I think even as if one were to accept that there is some truth to that short-term trade-off, there is, I think, very little truth in a medium-term and long-term. And then on top of that, you can actually introduce other elements that we were already discussing, that we were like equal opportunity, like a social mobility, and political participation. So if you take them as a whole package, it doesn't seem to me at all sort of likely that the original sort of point of view that there is a trade-off can be maintained. I actually think, on the contrary, that equality and growth are mutually reinforcing.
Yeah.
Let's go back to something you just mentioned, and I think all three of you have mentioned this, which is the issue of social mobility and opportunity. One of the things that I hear when I discuss this topic with others in the US is that maybe it's the case, right? We have to distinguish process from outcome. That we are willing as a society to tolerate a certain amount of inequality if we genuinely believe there is an equality of opportunity.
Right.
How do you think about this subject, social mobility, opportunity? Is it, how are they related to income inequality, and do you think that has also diminished today versus the past?
Can I just say empirically that we do know now that actually higher inequality is correlated with lower social mobility. So that's something that we know empirically, which we didn't know 50 years or 20 years ago. And I think that reinforces the argument that we all have, I think, made, is that a reduction of inequality is not only good for the reduction of inequality per se, but actually has many other positive effects, including a higher social mobility and basically allowing poor people or people from lower or middle class or whatever to actually get to positions where they would be much better off, and by becoming better off, they're also making the society better off.
Jean-Paul?
Yeah, I think the question is complex. We know much more today than we knew before. We have seen an increase in both kinds of inequality, inequality of opportunity and inequality, concrete inequality. We have seen also a decrease in social mobility everywhere. And this decrease has many explanations, well, one of which being the fear of of losing all your social capital when you have no power bargaining power vis-à-vis your employer. That means that you are much more precarious, and it's better to stay in your community than to go elsewhere. But that's not a very important thing I wanted to say. It's about this point linked to your former question. The problem is that the more and more I think to economics, and I think it's a conte pour enfants. I don't know how to say that. Is
Fairy tale.
Samuele. Huh?
Fairy tale.
Fairy tale. The fairy tale. You know why there exists no disequilibrium in economy? Because people are optimizing intertemporal trade-off between work and leisure. And that has led to a lot of Nobel Prize. We have believed this story of rational expectation, of knowing the future, of not having disequilibrium. What you are seeing is not unemployment, is measured unemployment. It's not involuntary unemployment, it's chosen unemployment. So the problem in such a situation, according to some economists, and I am really angry against some of these economists, is that they are ready to give up democracy, to have less redistribution and more inequality. In a nutshell, I made the reasoning of Barrow, Robert Barrow, who is saying that assuming that there is a scale of political regime from 0 to 1. 0 is total totalitarianism, and 1 is total democracy. And he said, what is the regime the most favorable to growth is 1/2. Which corresponded, I was saying it, to the Chile of Pinochet. But that is said in the 90s. No, it's not something which you can accept easily. But why it is like that? Because if there are too much equality, the median voter will succeed in his demand for redistribution of income. So that means that taxation will increase, and so incentive to invest and for capitalism will decrease. So when you consider that inequality should increase, whether real or inequality of opportunity, but social mobility should decrease because you avoid this way to spend too much by the state, so you avoid to increase the rate of interest. I remember of a debate I had with Prescott. He did a model for the United States and a model for France, which differs only by the rate of interest, the rate of taxation. And he said there is no wonder that France has a higher rate of unemployment, because the rate of taxation is higher. So I told him that, look, if you have two models differing by one variable, the only explaining variable can't be just this one variable.
Yeah.
So there is no other thing. What I want to say, not clearly, maybe, is that we are too much naive to accept the story which are told to us, and that we begin also naive in accepting the disequilibrium, the social disequilibrium, which are multiplying in a society. But there is one thing which is clear, is that in the US, it is the only country which is grounding inequality on philosophical study, on philosophical work. I mean, what was this school of philosophy which were libertarian? The libertarian are just justifying inequality. In the other country, inequality is justified by economic performance, by incentive, but not by the freedom of people.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. We actually are unfortunately coming to the end of this event. There's a lot here. I wish we had a lot more time to dive into it. I mean, you talked a lot about trust, Samuele. You know, the erosion of trust itself and in the institutions leading to maybe a lack of participation in the electoral system, which might otherwise be a way to remedy some of these inequities. I really appreciate you, all of you in your thoughts, Branko and Samuele, giving us a sense of kind of the magnitudes that are in front of us today. I think these are serious issues. I think they're bubbling up in different ways. To Jean-Paul's point, it's not showing up on election day quite the way it did 100 years ago, but I think the point about a disenfranchisement, a violence that's emerging in different parts of society, I think is worth noting. And for me personally, the erosion of social mobility is very insidious. The story I told you at the beginning of this, for me personally and for my family, is we know objectively in the data is less likely today. It has gotten harder. If you're born in a certain socioeconomic group today, you're less likely to move out of that socioeconomic group. Those are sobering data just for us to consider, I think, as a society. I mentioned China earlier. You know, China is a country that is dealing with inequality as well. And their response to it is going to sound very draconian in some sense. What they've done recently, just in the last 6 months, is they've banned all private tutoring companies because they give an undue advantage, they argue, to those who are rich. Now, that's not a solution that we would pursue here in the United States, but it just highlights that wealth inequality, income inequality begets income inequality, right? There are advantages that one accrues as one becomes more wealthy that self-fulfill. Anyways, we've got to stop there. And before we thank our speakers, I do need to make a couple of quick announcements. One, I do want to thank Illumia again for sponsoring this event. And the other announcement, and the irony won't escape you, that given the topic of this discussion, is that I've been asked to invite you to give generously at the donation table outside the room here or online at newyorkencounter.org/donate. Please join me in thanking all three of our speakers. Thank you very much.